Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining with us today. My name is Amy Hanshin, and for today's topic, what we're going to do is talk about some sketching tips and tricks. Since sketching is a huge part of what we do in SOLIDWORKS, I figured what we'll do today is go over some of my favorite tricks and tips that I've learned over the years. I'll start with some more common tips and then hit upon some lesser known ones as we go on. So what we're going to do is if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. And then at the end, I'll have a question and answer session. We can go over anything anybody might have some questions on. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and jump right into SOLIDWORKS. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by just drawing a simple rectangle. So I'm going to actually start on my front plane. I'll create a new sketch. And since I'm drawing a rectangle, I could use the rectangle tool up here, but I want to actually show some different ways to just draw some basic lines. So I'm going to just select my line tool here, and we're going to just simply draw a rectangle to start. So the most basic way to draw a line is you click your first endpoint. The second one is going to come up and you're going to draw your second endpoint and you created your first line. So you'll see that our cursor is still connected to that second endpoint and it's going to create another instance of a line until you create a closed contour. So that's what we're going to do is we're simply going to draw this rectangle. And once we get back to that first endpoint, you'll see that it discontinues the line tool. My cursor is no longer drawing another line. That's because we created a closed contour. And I can tell my contour is closed because I have this tool right here turned on. It's called Shaded Sketch Contours. If I simply click on it, you can see that it goes away. I like to leave this on all the time because that lets me know that my shape is watertight. And what I mean by that is that means that my shape is completely completely closed, which is usually what you want to create most extrusions. And so what's nice about this shaded contour is if I just go back to my regular cursor with a shaded contour, I can simply click inside the blue area and I can adjust the size and shape of my sketch here. So if I did not have that turned on, I wouldn't be able to do this. So let's take another look at ways to create lines, right? So I'm going to grab my line tool and we just showed the click method. But if we come in here and I click down and I drag, maybe I only want to create a single line. If you click down and drag and release, notice my cursor is no longer connected to that second endpoint. I can create a series of individual lines without creating a completely closed contour. So two different ways that we can do that. Let's say this inside shape that I'm creating, I want it to have a tangent arc at the very top. So what I'll do is I'm going to use the original method, just the click method. I'll come up here and you can see again, it's trying to create another line. But like I mentioned, maybe I want it to be a tangent arc instead. So what you can do to automatically transition to a tangent arc rather than going up to your sketch tab is if you actually hover your cursor back over that last endpoint and then come back up, you'll notice that it automatically transitioned into that tangent arc. And it'll follow whichever way your cursor goes. Another neat tip is that if you hit the A key, instead of going over the endpoint, it will also automatically transition to that tangent arc. So now if I click over here, you can see it did add that tangency here. So now what I can do is I want to go ahead, I'm just going to hit escape and I'm going to just exit out of this, and you can see now I have two closed contours. So I can actually grab in the shape and move this around. So what I want to do now is I want to go in and add some basic dimensions to my sketch. So normally I'd come up to my sketch tab, click on my Smart Dimension tool. Well, SOLIDWORKS tries to make it so that you have to make as little movements as possible. So you might have seen or use mouse gestures. So mouse gestures are when if you right click with your mouse, it brings up this little circle here. And depending on whether you're in a part, an assembly, a drawing, or a sketch, the commands that are available there will be different. So by right-clicking and just simply swiping up, I automatically grabbed my Smart Dimension tool. So rather than either hitting escape on my keyboard and then going and grabbing something else to switch back and forth between my selector or my Smart Dimension, I simply can just swipe up or swipe down. But that's because I have it customized to do that. If you want to set up mouse gestures, you can come up here to the top to your gear where the options are, hit the little drop down and come down to customize. The second to last tab up here is mouse gestures. And you can see again that there are different options depending on whether you're in a part, a sketch, an assembly, or a drawing. You can customize all of these. You can even change how many you want to use. Personally, I like to have a lesser amount because it just makes it really intuitive to just swipe up or down once you get a hang of what you have them set as. You can come over to the commands. Normally the ones we want to use are underneath tools. And if we come down here, you can see the different tools that are available. If I wanted to switch it, maybe I don't want a circle command, maybe I want that to be a center rectangle. All I need to do is drag and drop and place it, and you can see it replaced that circle command with that rectangle command. So just a really quick kind of nice way to set it up to make it customizable for the tools that you use most frequently. So let's try that. So I'll right click, swipe up, and I'm already in my Smart Dimension tool. I want to add some basic dimensions to the sketch. So it's important to note that when you're creating a new part and you create that first initial sketch, when you add your first dimension here, it's going to scale everything in your sketch to be proportional with what it already is established as. So for instance, when I click down and I tell this to be 3 inches instead of 5, if you watch my screen, you'll see it kind of expand and then get smaller. That's because it's scaling everything in my sketch to match that 3 inches. So let's just add a couple more dimensions here. So we want to dimension or maybe place this internal contour here. Maybe we want it to be directly in the center. So how can we do that? Well, let's grab a center line and we're going to hover over this line here to select that midpoint. And I'm going to draw a center line that goes all the way down. Even though we drew this contour here before we added that, we could make this point here of our arc coincident with this. But if I select this vertical line here, hold Control, select my center line, and then select the opposing side, you'll notice we actually do have a relation that comes up that allows me to make them symmetric. So if I make them symmetric now, once I adjust the shape, you can see that it happens to both sides because of that relation. Let's add a few more dimensions. Again, I'll use those mouse gestures to just quickly swipe up. You don't even have to see it once you get used to what you have them set up as. So maybe we want to dimension this top of the arc to the bottom here. I want to get that overall height. So what do? We normally would click that arc, right? Click this bottom line, go to dimension it, but it's not dimensioning to the very top of my arc, right? It's grabbing that center point. So what can we do? Well, we actually have a few options here. If I click down and accept that dimension, that's okay. We can say that it's, let's make it 1 inch, right? We're almost there. If we come over here to our property manager for our dimensions, we can go to our leaders tab, which is at the top. And at the very bottom, we have our arc condition. Right now it's set at center. If I wanted the maximum arc condition, you'll see that it adjusts my dimension to measure from the very top. If I go ahead, let's just delete that dimension. If I want to grab it from the outside automatically, if I hold Shift on my keyboard and grab that arc while you're in the Smart Dimension tool, and then select that line down there, it automatically grabs that outside perimeter of your arc there. So a very quick way to do that as well. Another way we could do that, if I went ahead and deleted that, is if you hover over for a moment on that arc, you'll notice that an endpoint does show up, and you can select that and then use that to dimension as well. So a couple different ways that you can dimension an arc. So we do want to add a couple more dimensions. You should fully define your sketches because down the road that will help with your design intent. For now, the actual size of it isn't too important. But let's go ahead and add a couple more contours to this sketch. I'm going to select my line tool here, and I'm going to start by just drawing a shape, something, let's say like this, right? And I have this sketch, and let's say I come down the road and I'm like, you know what? I think this, instead of being at an angle, I want this to just be a rectangle. So what can I do? If I select this line, I can select Shift and select this one, and I can tell them that I want these two to be collinear, right? So now I created this nice rectangle, except my rectangle is made of two horizontal collinear lines. Will it still extrude? Yes, but I want it to be just a single line. So what I can do is I can actually click on the endpoint that makes those two coincident. And if I hit delete, you'll notice it removes the collinear relationship because it actually automatically combines those two lines now to be a single line instead. So a really useful tip if you want to combine those two lines that are next to each other. So now that I have this one shape here, another reason that I love those shaded sketch contours is you'll notice that if I click once in the blue shaded area, it pre-selected all of those sketch entities pertaining to that rectangle. So I very easily can move this shape around. And what's super nice about it too is another cool trick is if you hold Control and you click on the shape while all your edges are selected, I can actually copy or move that shape. If I hold Control, notice behind my cursor, there's a little plus sign. That plus sign is indicating to me that it's going to make a copy of that sketch. If I release Control, what it'll do is it's only going to move that sketch down to where the yellow border is. But if I hold Control, see that plus sign, and drop it, it actually makes a copy of that sketch, so I don't have to draw two rectangles or use a pattern to create that. So again, that Control key, you want to select everything. If you don't have selected contours turned on, you'd have to Control select all of these to select all of them. Press that bottom corner or any edge like so, and you can move it or copy it. So if I release Control, it's just going to move that sketch over. So another really cool tip for creating multiple similar sketches. So now what I want to do is let's go ahead and we're going to go and extrude this. So we do have multiple nested contours, meaning we have different closed in areas of sketches. So when I come up to features and I extrude this, it's trying to extrude this outside contour and leaving these other areas as holes. but maybe I want to use those inside contours later on for different features. So that's where I want to pay attention to my property manager, where it says selected contours. If I expand this down here in this blue box, I can now tell it to either select contours, which is the outside perimeter, or regions, which is the inside area of that contour. So if I click on this outside, the outside original rectangle, that's a contour. It's going to select everything inside that contour and extrude it out. Or I could have selected all of the regions and it would have included everything and it would result in the same extrusion. In this case, we are going to do a blind. Instead of blind, let's do a mid-plane. So it's going to extrude our material out equal distances in both directions. So we'll go out a 1/2 inch and extrude this contour out. I'll click OK, and you can see we have just a nice old rectangular block. But where did all our sketches go, right? So they're absorbed into that feature. We can see sketch 1. If I select sketch 1 and I come up to features and then go to extrude again, we can reuse that sketch multiple times. So now underneath selected contours, I'll just right click to clear that selection. And now I can choose different areas of that sketch. Let's look at it normal too. So now maybe I want to extrude the regions here. Notice the center line does break it up into different regions. I can select 1/2 of this sketch block down here and maybe the other side here. If I rotate, you can see we're extruding it out. So right now it is extruding out from that original sketch plane, my front plane. But maybe I know this extrusion in my design intent is always supposed to be a 1/2 inch from this outside face. Well, what if this extrusion depth changes? I'm going to have to go back in and redo that math. So instead of doing the math and going, all right, well, I extruded it at a 1/2 inch, divided by 2, so it's a 1/4 inch plus this. Instead of doing that every time, especially if you know your plan is going to change maybe, don't forget that you have this option up here called from. So instead of using this extrusion from that sketch plane, I can choose a surface, choose this front surface here, and tell it that I wanted to just do a blind end condition and I wanted to go a 1/2 inch out from that selected face. So I can click OK. And now if this dimension here, this depth of our original extrusion ever changes, we will always maintain that design of having it come out a 1/2 inch from that surface. So just a useful tip there. The next thing that I want to go ahead and talk about is we're going to sketch on this surface here. So I'll select that surface, click sketch, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to draw a center line. And I want it to come across from this corner here to this corner here. And if you are still in the line tool, like I said, it tries to connect and create more lines until you create a closed contour. If you wanted to escape out of this command, a quick, easy way to do it, you could hit escape, but if you double click quickly, it cancels out that last line. Really useful. So now what I want to do is I want to create a feature that's symmetrical on both sides. So I'm going to come in and create another center line here. So something like this, double click to remove it. And I want to talk about another underutilized sketch tool called Dynamic Mirror Entities. I have it currently right now on my sketch tab. It's not there by default. So if you cannot find it, I recommend going to search commands and just typing it in, and you'll see where it is. If you click the little eyeball, it'll actually show you where to find it. In this case, it's not very useful because it points to it right there on my screen, but it will show you where it is. And you can actually drag and drop it right from that menu onto your sketch tab. So if I click on Dynamic Mirror Entities, what this allows me to do is it allows me to select a line, an edge, or a plane to dimension or to sketch on one side of, and it's going to automatically mirror it as I sketch, hence why it's called dynamic. So if I select the center line, notice it puts the symbol here indicating that now whatever I sketch on one side of it is automatically going to be generated on the other side. So let's give this a shot. If I grab my line tool, I can make it so that it's collinear with this other center line that I drew, and then I'm going to come up. Another useful tip when sketching is you'll notice because of my inference lines, it's automatically going to create a perpendicular relationship right now if I sketch this next line. Maybe I don't want it to grab that automatic relation. Maybe for some reason I don't want that. If that's the case, if you hit Control on your keyboard while sketching, notice it no longer picks up that automatic relation. So even if I'm at a perfect perpendicular angle right here, it's still not going to pick it up because I'm holding Control. So I can draw that line. It didn't grab that auto relation, but because I have that dynamic mirror entities turned on, you can see how it is creating the same exact geometry on the opposite side of that center line I established. So I drew this part with symmetry and it automatically did it to the other side. Very kind of cool little tip there. So if we look at this line here, we do have, it's underdefined. I'm going to switch to my Smart Dimension tool with the handy dandy mouse gesture. And I do want to show another cool trick. If I dimension from, let's say, this point to my center line, and I hover over it, it gives me the dimension between that point and the center line, as we expect. But what's nice is if I hover my cursor over to the other side of that center line, notice that it now gives me a difference. It gives me a diametric dimension. This is super useful if you know your sketch is going to be used for a revolve or something similar to that. So one side gives you the radial dimension. If you come across the center line, it gives you the diametric dimension. So just a neat tip there. So I'm going to go ahead and do an extruded cut with this. Normally, can I do an extruded cut? This is an open contour, right? It doesn't hold water. It's not shaded in. Normally, we want shaded in contours, but if we come up to features and we go to an extruded cut, we actually can use something called a thin feature. In this case, it usually does pick it up automatically, but when we do an extruded cut, it gives us another option with an open contour. Notice how I have an arrow going this direction. I can flip it so it goes this way. Basically, with my extruded cut and this sketch, I can tell it to remove all material from my part that's either on this side of my sketch or on this side of my sketch. In this case, with this sketch, because it doesn't completely come out of my solid body, this command would not work. If I tried to click OK, it would give me a rebuild error. But if I had extended these diagonal lines outward, it would have cut away all the material on this side. But that's okay, because that's not what I wanted to do right now anyways. I want to use this thin feature. So if I click on this thin feature and we look at this normal too, you can see that we have a nice equal distance or equal a dimension that's coming off of this sketch. We can choose if we want it to be a mid-plane direction, two direction. I'm going to go ahead and choose mid-plane. And what that does is it puts equal dimensions on either side of my line. And you can see we have it centered along the center line here. So we want to do a through all end condition. So it's going to cut all that material away. And because we want it to go in both directions, we definitely want to make it go through all. We can go ahead and click OK. And now we have that nice cutout there. Last couple tricks that I want to show is a relatively new trick, which is kind of cool, is I can choose an edge on my part and I can create a new sketch that is perpendicular or normal to that edge. And it's kind of confusing when you just describe it verbally. So let me show you what I mean. Let's say I want to create a sketch that's perpendicular to this edge, and I want it to be located at this point here. If I select this edge closer to this endpoint rather than this one, so I'll select it over here, come up to Insert, Sketch. What it does is it created actually a new plane that's perpendicular again to that edge. I'll just sketch a circle here to show you what I mean. So we'll sketch out a circle, exit our sketch. And if we look, it placed and created a new reference plane. It created plane 1 automatically. And it created it so that it's, again, normal to or perpendicular to that edge and coincident with the endpoint that I was nearest to when I selected that line. So again, another useful trick there. Then the last trick that I want to talk about is, let's say we started a new sketch on this front face, right? And I wanted to grab the loop around this cut extrude that I made. There's a lot of edges to it, so I probably don't want to sit here and select all of them. So I could select this face and click Convert Entities, right? But it normally converts the outside loop. That's what it does by default. So what can I do to select the inside loop? Well, I'm going to Control Z it to undo that Convert Entities. And before I click Convert Entities, again, I'll select that face, but I'll also Control Select an edge of that inside loop. So now when I click Convert Entities, it converted that inside loop instead of the outside loop. This worked on this cut extrude loop, but if I had selected one of the edges of these extrusions here, it would have also worked and selected that interior loop as well instead. So another relatively unknown little trick for working in sketches. So that was the last trick I had in my sleeve for today. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. All right, so it doesn't look like I have too many questions. I hope I shared some interesting tips and tricks with you today. This will be available as a recording afterwards. So hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for joining CAD Dimensions Lunch and Learn.